Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us for the Behind the Headlines event, Deciphering Trump's Intelligence and National Security Policy. The timing couldn't be better. As we were discussing earlier, had it been last night, we might not have had all our speakers and certainly not our moderator. The speakers for tonight are Mary Louise Kelly, National Security Correspondent for NPR News, Ellen Nakashima, National Security Reporter for the Washington Post, and David Sanger, National Security Correspondent and Senior Writer for the New York Times. So we're extremely pleased to welcome David back again. He's been a regular for a while, and to welcome Mary Louise and Ellen for the first time, and we hope this will be the first of many times. I'm Patricia Ellis, president of the Women's Foreign Policy Group. We promote women's leadership, women's voices on key international issues of the day. So on behalf of our board members here tonight, Elizabeth Buemiller, Isabel Jazanowski, Maureen White, and our partners here at NYU Washington, D.C. We're so glad you could join us. And we're pleased to be back here for this really timely event, and we appreciate NYU's warm hospitality and partnership. And we're glad to see some of the students here, including some of our interns who probably checked you in tonight, and our former intern, who is the photographer tonight. Before we begin, I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to the ambassadors and other diplomats here with us tonight. So if the diplomats want to just stand, and we can give you a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we also have an exciting schedule of upcoming events, including, May's been really busy, but including an upcoming event with the Mexican ambassador and our celebration of women diplomats, which will be held at the Embassy of Luxembourg. And all this information can be found in your program book, and we look forward to seeing you. So my last task for the evening is, and it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome back tonight's moderator, Elizabeth Buemiller. As I mentioned, she's a WFPG board member and the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times. She previously covered the Pentagon, the White House, and John McCain's 2008 campaign. Elizabeth, take it away.
Okay, you can hear me? Thank you, Pat, and thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you especially to the panelists, because we all know how busy it's been. You have the biographies of my esteemed panelists here in front of you, but just to say that Ellen is a very formidable competitor of ours at the Washington Post. Her stories pop up, and I get phone calls about them at night at home about 10 o'clock from our night editor saying the Post is reporting. Ellen has also shared the Pulitzer Prize in 2014, which is very impressive. David Sanger I have known forever, just about forever. We go back to 30 years, close to 30 years. We first met in Tokyo. David and I covered the White House together. It was the George W. Bush White House. My first day on the beat was September 10th, 2001. So that was and David has been 3 times been part of teams that won the Pulitzer Prize, including this year and this spring for the series in the Times called Russian Dark Arts. And David was a big key part of a story about the DNC hack. Mary Louise Kelly, I have known not quite as long as David, but we used to travel together and we both covered the Pentagon. And on top of all of her smarts and reporting chops and news skills, she's written 2 novels, which is extremely impressive to me. I've been trying to write a novel for about 6 years. So anyway, so congratulations. So what I want to do is just start off and ask everybody about topic A, which is the firing of the FBI director at the Trump White House, what this means for the Russia investigation, what it means for the future of the Trump White House, and what it means for what happens on the Hill. And then we can also talk a bit about, I know that David can't be on any panel without talking about North Korea. And because he really is actually, David knows as much about North Korea as, way more about, he knows as much about North Korea as many people in the government, if not more. And
I'm not sure that's a good thing.
yeah, covering it for decades. And then we can touch on Iran and ISIS and stuff. But why don't we all just start with each of you saying, for just a few minutes, talking about your take on the Comey firing and what happens now. And then I'm going to ask questions of everybody, but I won't go on too long because I want to hear your questions. So Ellen, start.
Well, the Trump's firing of Comey last night took everyone by surprise, and it stunned I think not only reporters in the Hill, just pretty much everyone. We talked, including folks inside the FBI and the Justice Department, and we obviously wanted to know, well, what impact will this have on the Russia investigation that's going forward, that began last summer, late July, and that FBI Director Jim Comey publicly acknowledged in March. I think the firing can't help but have throw a monkey wrench in the works and raise huge doubts about, or huge concerns about whether this investigation can continue in an impartial way, and even more importantly, be perceived by the public, by the American public, as being impartial. I think the career investigators and prosecutors who are working the investigation will continue to work it as best they can, and will do their darndest to continue trying to find out whether in fact there was any evidence of collusion between Trump associates and the Kremlin. But there are some concerns about whether or not there will be any interference from the next, next FBI director, whether the next FBI director will be able to assure not just the FBI and the DOJ, but the American public that he can oversee this investigation in an impartial way. So, start with that.
Well, I think if the president's objective, and we don't know entirely what his objective was, but if the objective was to try to quiet the Russia investigation, I think he's pretty much assured himself at this point the opposite effect. The movement on the Hill, as both Ellen and I were writing last night, to get some kind of independent commission, independent committee, some say an independent prosecutor, I think that's less likely, I think now is probably going to gain some steam. Whoever the poor soul is who gets appointed to be Jim Comey's successor is going to find him or herself under a complete microscope. If they do too little on the Russia story, you're going to see a sea of leaks, I would predict, from both the Justice Department and the FBI, which will further enrage President Trump, who was asking Jim Comey at various points, why aren't you spending more time hunting down the leaks instead of following this dead-end story? If, on the other hand, he does too much, or she does too much, I think they'll find that they're going to run into the same problem that Mr. Comey did. The pretense that the White House gave for the firing, which was not Comey's handling of the Russia probe, but rather of the Hillary Clinton emails, just doesn't seem to wash. First of all, you had both President Trump and as candidate Trump, and Jeff Sessions, now the Attorney General, then a senator, praising his activities when he reopened the investigation to look at additional emails and whether Huma Abedin had been sending material through her husband. The second reason it doesn't wash is that you could have made the exact same argument that they made in those memos that were released last night on January 21st. You didn't need to wait until now. And to do it now, after, as Ellen has pointed out, Comey has already publicly acknowledged that there is an investigation underway into whether there was any collusion between Mr. Trump's associates and the Russians, gives the appearance, if it isn't the reality, of dismissing the person who's running the investigation. And that edges as close as we have ever seen to suggestions of possible obstruction. So I think he's walked himself into more trouble than he knew or needed to get to.
I would second the comments of my two panelists, and thank you, and thanks to NYU and the Women's Foreign Policy Group for hosting. I would commend you on having the foresight to have organized this in the middle of a huge breaking national security story, and then it occurs to me that that would apply to just about any night of the last 6 months, so here we are. I would point to, there were maybe two moments today that struck me that stand out and are maybe worth remembering as we go forward and see how this all spins out. One is, of the reactions on the Hill, some of which were very predictable, the one that surprised me was Senator Burr of North Carolina, who's the Republican chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, so leading that investigation. Also, don't forget, was a Trump campaign advisor. In the months that we've been covering this investigation, I've never heard him say anything critical of Trump or the Trump White House. And he had a statement last night that basically said he thinks this will set back the Senate investigation, that Comey's departure is a loss to the country, and that he's disturbed by it. And I thought about that and thought, I wonder, with hindsight, weeks or months from now, whether that may mark some sort of moment, some sort of shift. A shift to what I don't know, toward a more aggressive congressional investigation, maybe to Trump facing these increased questions about obstruction of justice, abuse of power. I don't know, but that was noteworthy of all of the things coming out of the Hill. The other moment you have to point out today is just the optics at the White House. President Trump, 24 hours ago, we're just at 24 hours ago, fired the man leading the investigation into Russia and Team Trump. And today he welcomed to the White House Russia's foreign minister and the Russian ambassador. And the only reason we know that happened is because Russian state news media was allowed in to photograph it. They did not let in an American photographer to document this moment or to ask questions or anything else. Amazing.
To clarify, it's a bizarre, this is really interesting because we actually wrote a story about this, and it's in David's story tonight as well, that in these situations where it's closed press, each side is allowed to have its official photographer. So the White House let in its official photographer. The Russian side let in its official photographer, who was also one and the same, is the state news photographer. Yeah. In this country, we separate those jobs. In Russia, they don't. The result was this bizarre photo credit where the photos came out and they were by tasks. And I think we're going to run one tomorrow, crediting tasks. I think that was when I left the office, that was the plan, because we had no other photos of this.
But it gets worse than that. Okay.
Yeah.
Just when you think that's about as bad as you could get. So Lavrov went to the State Department first before he went to the White House and met Secretary Tillerson. There was a very funny scene going into the office where somebody shouts to him, does the whole firing of Comey cast a shadow over this meeting? And he said, Comey was fired? Really? Really? Is that what happened? Right. So he, after done mocking that up, the State Department gave no briefing where we could explore what the two men discussed. Not atypical for Secretary Tillerson, whose embrace of the press has included ejecting us from the airplane. Not at 30,000 feet, he's done it on the ground. Then Lavrov, who is about as masterful at playing the Western media as anybody I know, invites people up for a little press briefing of his own at the Russian embassy. So the accounts of the meetings with President Trump and with Tillerson that you are going to read tomorrow come thanks to the transparency and openness of the Russian government.
Which is the same as it unfolded in Moscow.
That's right.
When
Yeah, tell
Tillerson
that
went to
story.
Moscow, the same thing. He didn't bring an American reporter, so we know what happened thanks to
Right, now
our
they did
Russian
have a
friends.
joint press conference at that time where at least we could pull something out, and then Lavrov did some additional things. So the Russians have looked at this and they've said, boy, Tillerson's silence is our opportunity.
The Russians have played this marvelously. I mean, since last year, we know they have been engaged in an unprecedented sort of ratcheting up of an influence campaign in the United States to try to undermine our democratic processes, sow discord, and skillfully exploit the divisions in our society. And President Trump just sort of played into their hands with this latest firing, his firing of the FBI director, which just totally inflamed the Democrats. He thought maybe they would get up and cheer because here he was getting rid of the guy who had helped their candidate, Hillary Clinton, lose or helped Trump win. But no, instead, I mean, they're angry that, he's seeming to obstruct this investigation. So in a sense, I think, this also just really just furthers the Russians' influence operation.
So let me just interject here. To the extent that you are willing to talk about it, where is the investigation at this point into possible collusion of Trump associates and Russia?
I think the challenge in assessing that is that the investigation is potentially, it feels almost infinite. I mean, this could go for forever. And in part that's because every time one of us files a new story, it gets added to the stack of things that they need to look into. I mean, I think that the consensus seems to be that the Senate investigation on the Hill seems to be making the most progress, but they've interviewed several dozen witnesses. The witness list keeps growing rather than shrinking. They have access to documents, but they privately will concede that they don't have the staff that they need to get through those documents, just in terms of number of eyeballs on the number of thousands of pages of classified documents coming in. The House intelligence investigation appears to be in a better state than it was a month ago, although that bar is very low. It was sidetracked and looked as though it was falling apart completely, and we wait to see when they'll report back with some progress. And then the FBI effort has been upended. I think was the verb you used, which I stole and was using on NPR this morning, but upended by what's happened with Comey. Of course, the intelligence professionals who have a task, it's not like Comey was personally doing all of the heavy lifting on this, but you remove the guy who was running it, and whoever succeeds him, there'll be a confirmation process and a delay, and no ironclad guarantee that they will continue an aggressive investigation.
Yeah, and I don't think we have a sense yet, I mean, from what we're gleaning from people who've talked to investigators or who get briefed by investigators, we don't know yet of any hard or concrete evidence that points to actual coordination or collusion, but the investigation is still in early days. I mean, in a counterintelligence investigation, which can, as David pointed out, stretch on for years. This started in July. This is still in its infancy, and we don't know how the loss of Director Comey will slow this investigation down. I mean, Richard Burr, the Senate Intelligence Chairman, has said he fears that this will impede their own investigation. I mean, just getting documents over to the committees that have to come from the FBI, for instance, that could all slow down now. So far from making this go away for President Trump, I think he's maybe just prolonged it.
What would be I mean, I don't want to ask too many specific questions here, but what, you said there's no evidence so far of collusion.
There may be
that you've been told
that we've
about.
been told,
right.
Yeah,
And so
made aware
what
of.
evidence, what would that, if there were such evidence, what would it be? And the collusion would be a member of a Russian intel agency speaking or emailing a member of the Trump team about.
Well, I can give you a couple
Give
of
an example to the audience, right?
So remember, there are sort of two big bins of this investigation. One of them is the one that occupied me and Ellen from June of last year really through the end of the Obama administration. And that's simply the remarkable story of the Russian hacking, how they stole the material, how the US was completely clueless about what was going on, how the FBI exchanged emails back and forth with an utterly incompetent IT administrator at the Democratic National Committee for 9 months while the Russians kept cleaning things out. There are babies in this world who were conceived and born in the time that it took the U.S. government to figure out what was going on here, which is really remarkable.
I'm never going to be able to think about this in the same way.
So that's one batch. And then the second question of collusion has got sort of two themes to it. One is, was there someone on the Trump team who in any way was providing clues, hints, coordination with the Russians, with the FSB or the GRU or their associates to say, you know, tonight would be a really nice night to go dump some of these documents. So, for example, John Podesta's emails showed up, they were stolen in March, but they didn't actually get published until October.
October 7th.
October 7th. By coincidence, about 12 hours after that tape in which then candidate Trump was deeply respectful to women of the world, and sort of clearly was intended to change the topic. So one of the questions is, did the Russians figure this out for themselves by having CNN on?
Right, that's the,
Right.
they need someone to
Or
tell them.
did
Right.
someone need to go tell them? And actually, I saw somebody today who was involved in this part of the investigation, and he said, I think the Russians could figure that out. They could figure the rest of this out. They could figure that out. So that's number one. Then the second surrounds the kind of conversations that you've heard about involving Michael Flynn and perhaps others, in which there were conversations with Ambassador Kislyak, who was in the Oval Office today, about why they shouldn't get too upset about the Obama sanctions on Russia at the very end of his presidency. Don't worry, we'll take care of this. Whatever it is the transcript shows that ultimately got Flynn fired. So that's another form of collusion if there was some kind of effort to undercut the policy that Obama was putting in place.
That's exactly right, although I wanted to point out that if in that instance of former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn having these conversations with Kislyak and then misleading the vice president about the nature of them, that they were discussing sanctions, the ostensible crime or violation would be a violation of something called the Logan Act, which is a law that dates back to 1799 and has never been actually prosecuted. So I think the sense was it would not likely be a prosecutable, it would not be an offense that he would be prosecuted for, but it certainly raised questions about his judgment and whether he was doing anything untoward to undermine the foreign policy of the Obama administration, which had on December 29th imposed economic sanctions on a number of Russian individuals and officials of the GRU, the spy agency, and taken some other measures. Was the Trump administration going to try to roll back those efforts?
Let me ask another question. In the letter that Trump wrote to Comey, the second graph was very peculiar. You may have noticed that the president told Comey that you told me despite the fact that you told me 3 times I wasn't under investigation, I nonetheless am firing you. Can you, Mary Louise, shed any more light on that? What 3
really
times
wish
he's
I could.
talking about and what he means? It was the most mysterious paragraph.
That was a topic of conversation in our newsroom as we were going into rolling coverage, and I've got the producers in the NPR studio. I was at home as this news broke, so you build a kind of pillow fort around you to muffle the echo of the room. So I'm sitting there with Star Wars pillows around me because my 11-year-old bedroom was close. My 11-year-old son's bedroom was closest to where I was working. And I'm getting the down the line saying, you're on in 30 and you can explain that second graph, right? And I'm thinking,
Don't look at me.
where's Mara Eliason when you need her? I thought that I can't explain it. It raises several interesting questions. Among them, in a letter in which he says, I'm taking this action based on the recommendations of my Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General. And What they said was this is all about Hillary Clinton's emails. And yet in the second graph of the firing letter, he's referring to the Russia investigation. If that wasn't a part of it, why mention it in the letter? I don't know. I don't know if y'all have good sources on what these
I
three
just want-
sources
I
are,
just
but it
want
would
to
be
know-
weird if he
in-
had been warned and told you're not under investigation.
In our
Yeah.
news meeting
Do
today,
you
we
have an
asked the
ongoing
question, did a
investigation or
lawyer
not?
read that letter before it went out? And if so, does he still have a job? You know?
I don't think President Trump has lawyers read his tweets before he tweets them out either, unfortunately.
Well, we were speculating that perhaps the FBI director, Comey, told Trump in December when he briefed him on the dossier, when he went to Trump Tower. We were also debating, I don't know, whether or not it was appropriate for the FBI director to be discussing with the president an open investigation into his associates. We were just speculating. We have no answers. We were thinking, well, perhaps Trump said, hey, am I under investigation? Answering that would have made any FBI director very uncomfortable. So who knows what happened, and who knows if what Trump wrote is reality. We just don't, the story has legs, as we say. So let me ask you about Rosenstein, Rod Rosenstein, the letter he wrote, which also was part of the packet last night. The White House says that he acted on his own. 2 weeks into the job, he decided to write a letter saying that Comey was not fit for the job because of the Clinton email investigation. What is your take? I realize I'm just throwing you softballs in a way. What is your take on that letter?
I think that's strange credulity. I mean, Rod Rosenstein is a highly respected career prosecutor who was, prior to becoming the Deputy Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney in Maryland. And he was the only Republican U.S. Attorney in all of the Obama administration who kept on. He had been appointed under the Bush administration, but was held on. And his colleagues, all Democratic colleagues from the Obama administration, think very highly of him, but were scratching their heads at why he could have written this letter, this 2.5-page letter that went into, I have to say, his analysis of what Jim Comey did and said last year, first in holding a press conference in July in breaking with tradition, long-held tradition of not discussing investigations, but to not only hold the press conference, and to say that he was not recommending charges against Hillary Clinton for her use of an private email server, but then to proceed to lambast her for her sloppy, practices, cybersecurity practices. I mean, Rosenstein rightly pointed out that Comey was doing something quite unorthodox there. And then in October 28th, 11 days before the election, Comey drops the nuclear bomb with the letter to Congress, which he knew would become public in an instant, saying that he was reopening the investigation. Again, that violated not only the precept of not discussing an ongoing investigation, but also another longstanding Justice Department policy of not taking any steps so close to an election that could influence the outcome of the election. So I think the analysis that Rod Rosenstein did in his letter was probably pretty spot on, but it was his last paragraph where he then makes the leap to saying, and therefore, we must basically fire Jim Comey. I think that's the part that had people up in arms and scratching their heads.
It also read a little more like a political document than a legal one. I mean, it cited newspaper articles, the opinions of Democrats and Republicans who used to serve in the Justice Department, which were all sort of interesting, but they were in the realm of opinion. And we can all have an opinion about Comey's actions, and there's lots of room in there for second guessing. But again, to do that now in the midst of the Russia investigation was something he sort of didn't deal with. I should say, by full disclosure, that I was on the receiving end of a Rod Rosenstein leak investigation for 4 years into the stories about how the United States got into Iran's centrifuges with the cyber attack. So you should discount my view by the knowledge that I've come up against his investigative powers. But from everything I've heard about him, has been very complimentary. And this struck me as not fully a legal document and probably put together pretty hastily.
Yeah.
The central question is the one that you nodded to, David, which is almost every word of that letter could have been written on January 21st.
Right.
So what changed other than him moving to a new position at the Justice Department? And then you weigh that against the development that the Times was out in front of today about that Comey last week met with Rosenstein, apparently asked for more resources, more money, more personnel for the Russia probe, briefed very small group of lawmakers about it on Monday, and then was fired on Tuesday. Circumstantial, but it's really interesting circumstantial evidence
The other
from a
thing
legal
we've
point of view.
reported now on our website is this, just they were putting all the pieces together, is that Trump on Sunday was at Bedminster at the golf club and was watching the Sunday shows and was becoming more and more agitated and angry about Comey and the fact that Comey last week had said that he was mildly, was it last week?
Yes.
Mildly nauseous to think that he had tipped the election towards Trump. So he was in a rage. He had wanted to fire Comey for a long time, according to this account, and this was, they hastily put some stuff together, which is then we have yesterday. So
It's
let me,
the story of this administration so far.
yeah.
Watch
yeah.
TV, react.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me ask, since this, I'm going to ask two more questions, and I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Since the topic of this is deciphering Trump's intelligence and national security policy, I do need to ask one question, sort of a broader question, which is, if you had to define Trump's national security policy, how would you define it? I mean, we're talking about, you know, more troops to Afghanistan, the strike in Syria, the saber rattling on North Korea, the flipping on supporting NATO, pulling out of the of NAFTA, saying he was going to pull out of NAFTA and then not pulling out of NAFTA, pulling out of TPP. How is there a way you could make sense of this? David, you want to?
Yeah, I guess I'll take a first shot.
Yeah.
First of all, if I had to, it would be unfair to try to define a Trump doctrine at 110 or 15 days. And that would be equally unfair if you were trying to do it for President Obama, if you tried to do it for George W. Bush. I mean, if we were thinking of trying to define the Bush doctrine at 100 days in and 9/11 was still, you know, a number of months away, we would have had something that bore no resemblance to what the Bush doctrine ultimately became.
Remember, we were all obsessed with the spy plane, remember?
We were obsessed with
thought
the
that was
spy
the
plane,
end of the world.
and because George Bush had said, I'm going to pull back from the Middle East
Right.
and focus on relations with Mexico. Well, that wasn't really what his administration's likely to be remembered for. And I was near the Nixon Library 2 weekends ago and walked through it. It's been wonderfully redone. But, you know, if you tried to define Nixon's foreign policy before the opening to China, you know, you'd have it completely wrong. So let's remember that it's early days yet. The second thing is, clearly he believes in a slightly inchoate combination of the United States has to look and act tougher, and thus the attack on the Syrian base, but that at the same time, we have to pull back to our shores. And what you're seeing is the tension between those two. In 2 long interviews that Maggie Haberman and I did with him on foreign policy last year, he basically defined an America in which you pull the troops back, you let the Japanese and the South Koreans defend themselves, you let Europe defend itself unless they're willing to pay much more, that we'll be a mercenary army, but that we don't have interests abroad. And if there's been one big shift in the past 100 days, it's the education of a president that the projection of power abroad is critical to America's own safety, that you want to be able to take on these issues someplace other than in the continental United States. So I think that's defined some of his shifts. We know that he's incredibly transactional. And so, he said the other day, we will give the Chinese a better deal on trade if they help us more in North Korea. Now, there have been lots of American presidents who have thought that, not many who have put it in their Twitter feed. So it is a little bit obvious to them, and I think to the Chinese, it's a great gift because they can decide which side of Trump they want to go play off of the other. And by the way, this whole thing of dealing only with the kids, princelings is something the Chinese understand, so they've got that one down. So I think that's been another big defining element. I think North Korea, in the end, is going to be the definitional issue. And the reason is that he's put the entire relationship with China on the basis of how helpful they'll be. And because he has said repeatedly, I am not out here to kick this problem down the road, as my predecessors did, and they did. I am out here to solve this problem. Now, the hard part gets when you try to ask them what the solution looks like.
Does anybody want to add to what the Sanger asked?
Just quickly, I think you're absolutely right. The education of a president is the theme of these first months. This is such a steep learning curve, and that would be true of any new president, of course. And then also moving somewhat, this also true of every new president, moving away from the campaign trail rhetoric toward what is somewhat more recognizable conservative Republican foreign policy. He hasn't done some of the things that he threatened to do on the campaign trail. The Iran nuclear deal stands. The U.S. has not pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. NATO is now no longer obsolete.
Right.
But then you get thrown a curveball like the strikes in Syria and try to figure out, well, what is the policy on Syria? And I don't know that we have any more insight into that now than we did before the missile strikes on Syria.
I couldn't add anything more to what Dave and Mary Lou said, except to just add that this is a president who hasn't really shown an interest in foreign policy. I mean, as a candidate, that wasn't one of his main themes. And what I'm told is that he came in with a pretty low base to start with of knowledge when it comes to the outer world, and that he is now getting longer. He's getting fairly long, lengthy intelligence briefings, but it can be frustrating when you're dealing with someone who is, as David mentioned, transactional, kind of takes decisions by gut, by instinct, by how he gets on or not with another foreign leader. So I think he's brought in a pretty solid core of national security advisors. H.R. McMaster, one, and Rex Tillerson is also respected. So perhaps his education will, lead him somewhere good in the next year or so.
A question about coverage. How do you handle dealing with this administration as journalists? I mean, how much different is it from Obama and the previous presidents? And what are the biggest? I mean, I know the answers, but do you tell? What are the biggest challenges you're facing? With
my
this?
answer, in some ways, there's so much more access because the leaks are plentiful.
Yeah.
And it's surprising sometimes who you call, and they pick up your phone and they'll take your call and talk to you from their desk in the White House, and their predecessor in that particular post wouldn't. Among the shifts I've noticed, it used to mean something on our beat. As we know, you're feeling around for crumbs in the dark. Everything is classified and nobody wants to talk on the record. And when you got far enough along in a story that you went and you tried to get confirmation from the White House, that meant something. Didn't mean you'd sussed out the whole story and you had it all nailed down, but it meant something. And now, you look at the example just in the last couple of weeks. If the Trump administration tells you that we have an aircraft carrier steaming toward North Korea, well, maybe we do, or maybe it's going in the exact opposite direction. How do you handle that? Today we had, in this story that I nodded to on the Russia investigation, and the development that it appears that Comey asked for more resources just a few days before being fired, and you had the very mixed messages coming out, depending on who you were reaching at the White House or Justice Department, contradicting each other. In some cases, on the record. That is different. That's an administration
Right.
that's still finding its way and coming together and gelling.
I mean, part of it is the administration is still very inchoate. There are many positions, many positions that aren't filled yet. We're still dealing with empty seats or actings or former, career people who are not actually part of the policy-making chain. A lot of these sort of, not the top level, but maybe second or third level down, deputy assistant secretaries, for instance, those jobs haven't been filled yet. The appointees are not there, so it's hard to really understand sometimes if you're actually getting the current policy of the current policymakers. On the other hand, in the intelligence community, national security world of, say, the Justice Department and the FBI, we're still dealing with a lot of, there's just career people that we've been dealing with for years now, and so there's some continuity there, but then they'll often have to sometimes say, we don't know yet what the official policy is yet from the top. So there's that challenge.
Do you want to say this?
Well, we don't waste a lot of time sitting in detailed policy briefings. That's good. So you have more time to spend on other things. Last week, for the first time, we had a number of senior officials take a bunch of reporters in and try to sort of talk their way through a broader foreign policy. And it was a little.
It was the 100 days.
It was at
Yeah.
100 days, and it was a little hard to watch, but at least that they were trying to engage and saw a necessity to go do that. And so I commend them for sort of getting out ahead and doing it. They're still a little bit uncertain of how you go deal with the press. The Tillerson examples I gave before are one. Elizabeth had to sit through many meetings as we were getting ready to publish a story about 2 months ago about a cyber operation against the North Korean missile program. And it was interesting to see this administration confront, I think for the first time at that moment, a story that dealt with a very detailed covert operation that they had inherited. And they clearly didn't quite understand how you go about this careful dance with the press about making the argument about what classified material should stay classified. When the whole thing's classified, sitting down to discuss it is difficult for them. And I found out later on that many of them had gone out, or several of them had gone out and actually called up members of the Bush administration and said, what do we do when somebody comes to us with a story about a classified program? And they had to sort of talk them through sort of press handling 101 on this kind of thing. I thought it was good that they were reaching out, but it tells you a little bit how new this is to them, that they didn't understand how this operation works.
Interesting. Okay, guys, who has some questions? And sure, and I gotta just tell us who you are.
1 second. Is there a mic or?
Well, I can hear you. if you
There's a
wanna-
mic coming down to
Yeah.
you.
Mic coming down.
You can also yell. But.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Jen Leonard with International Crisis Group. Well, first of all, thanks for the job that you do. We're all trying to make sense of it, and you play a really valuable role in helping with that effort. I guess on the Comey, specific issue, in just watching the coverage last night, I mean, picking up on the newness point that you just made, David, I just had a hard time digesting last night that officials were blindsided by this, that the White House was as blindsided as the reporting indicated. And what's your sense? Was that accurate? If it is, what does that say about their read on this? And where was the decision, what also does it say about where the decision point was? Because from where I'm sitting as a taxpayer and a concerned citizen, it looks like the buck stopped with the president and everybody caught up. The other question that I had that didn't come up yet was whether or not and how they may fit in this reference to grand juries is playing in, and if you have any status report on that.
I'll take a first whack at your first question, because Ellen and I were discussing this very point on the way in. You know, is it possible that the White House did not think it would be a huge, big deal to fire the director of the FBI, which is what they are saying? The evidence to support that would be that you know, just the tick-tock of how the White House announced this last night was that it was supposed to go out in an email, and then Sean Spicer walked into the White House briefing room and announced it, and then he left and went and locked himself in his office, and then finally came out and briefed by the shrubbery where the TV cameras are off the West Wing.
SNL is going to be so great on Saturday.
I mean, Sean Spicer jumping out from behind the shrubbery on the White House lawn. You know, there was not a masterful plan for rolling this out to reporters last night. Usually when the White House rolls out something like this, that's, you know, a big personnel decision, they have talking points lined up. They have surrogates. They have legal experts lined up to explain to you, so that hopefully we will explain to everyone else why this is no constitutional crisis and why this isn't an abuse of power, and how this is a really good thing for the country to give the FBI a fresh start. And there are many legal experts out there who will tell you that, who will tell you that this wasn't illegal. The president did everything within his authority. It's his call who he wants to be the FBI director. There is a persuasive argument that the White House could make. They didn't make it. All they did was shove out, you know, the letters from Trump and the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, and then it blew up last night.
What one source told us was that apparently it was very closely held, and the decision was not made with the political advisors who might have at least been able to say, hey, wait a minute, if you're going to fire the FBI director, you might want to think a little bit about first how this is all going to play before you do it. And you know, secondly, I would say this is not the first time they've kind of misgauged the reaction. I think back to the rollout of their travel ban on Muslims, 7 Muslim countries, which came out on a Friday night. That, you know, apparently they didn't think it was going to create such the furor that it did, and you know, so I don't think they have their communications plan perfectly, you know, worked out yet.
We've been to this movie before, as Ellen says. I mean, I think the EOs, the executive orders, were a really interesting example. I remember the first week, one night, the first week of the administration, when they were turning out dozens of executive orders, or trying to turn out dozens of executive orders. One evening, I came back from a talk very much like this one. My phone was just like jammed up with stuff, and I thought, gee, maybe somebody like flown into a building or something. And it turned out it was just leaked executive orders, more than we could have gotten into the paper that night. And we pulled out one and put it in the paper that night, which was one that still has not been signed, that extended the life of Gitmo. We expected that, and called for the reopening of the black sites, which is where the CIA did their interrogations.
Oh God, I remember this night.
Yeah.
Right, which is because there's such because I think I called you at midnight.
We were on the phone
yes.
at midnight, and I've
Yeah.
been saying, "Are you sure?
Because there's been
How
such
can
a
they do this?"
yeah, there's been such a demand, you know, from the countries where we kept these black sites. Please bring them back in. They're great tourist attractions. So we got that one in the paper that night, and when I finally got around to decoding why it got leaked to us, the answer was fascinating. That the entire circulatory system of the interagency process, where you take a proposal and you send it around for comment, and someone says, you know, we tried this 7 years ago and it really blew up, and something, that had all been short-circuited in their desire to get out for revolutionary change, which was Steve Bannon sort of, you know, dismantle the administrative state, a phrase we haven't heard in a few weeks. It was leaked, I'm now convinced, as a warning to the Secretary of Defense and the director of the CIA that, hey, this thing's about to go get signed. So if you're going to throw your body in the way of it, you better do it now. And in fact, Secretary Mattis, we think, read the story in the Times the next morning, bored a neat hole in the ceiling. And when the next version of the EO leaked out, which took another week, the black sites thing was gone.
Yep.
Yes, right here.
Donna Constantinople, and I wanted to just ask who you all think might calm the waters if the morning shows are any indication. I mean, they're using language like constitutional crisis and our country's about to. What I wanted to know is there someone he could name as the FBI? What would be the profile? Who do you think that might be? And then following on your comment that he is now sitting through long briefings, which a lot of people frankly probably don't know that.
Daily briefings. We don't know how long they are, but near daily briefings.
Daily briefings, and I think I read that Robert Costa had said that he's been very isolated just the last few days, that he's been in a funk or been, what do you think the rest of the world, as he's about to leave on a very important global journey now, his first one out, what do the North Koreans, do they see him as a decisive, this FBI thing is not, maybe it's being seen differently outside of our perspectives? So those are my questions.
I'll leave the North Korea question to you, David, but as far as who he might appoint, we're hearing some names being floated, and who knows how serious this is, but some of the names include former deputy attorney generals like Larry Thompson, who was a deputy in the Bush administration, George W. Bush, some other former deputies. I think you'll need at least someone with a track record who's respected, but even someone like that will be in for a grilling when it comes to their confirmation on the Hill. It will not be a smooth or easy. You could put up, another Jim Comey, before he got into his controversies last year, and I think he would still face a tremendous grilling on the Hill. So it's going to be tough.
I mean, Democrats are already threatening to hold up the confirmation for whoever it is until they get some sort of independent investigation, whether it's a special counsel or prosecutor or independent committee or something. So, I mean, it's almost an impossible job to fill, isn't it? I mean, Trump is not going to appoint someone who he doesn't feel is, shares his worldview and his view of how these things should proceed, and Democrats are never gonna let that person through. So then, all they need is 51 votes, if I'm not mistaken, to get this through. But it's gonna be a battle to watch. And meanwhile, the FBI investigation, well, the professionals will continue it, but it becomes yet another sideshow, huge circus to all of this.
I think a characteristic of this administration is its loyalty above all. So when Sally Yates did what she did with the immigration order, and you heard Sean Spicer was asked about this again the other day, he said, well, I'm not entirely sure that she was somebody who shares our worldview or our goals. Well, that isn't what you're looking for in a deputy attorney general. You're looking for somebody to give you an independent legal analysis about whether something is legal, whether it's constitutional, two different kind of questions. And you don't hear that. You don't hear it from Mr. Spicer. You don't hear it from the president, who says about Jim Comey, well, he was very nice to Hillary Clinton, as opposed to he came to a legal conclusion I disagreed with about Hillary Clinton. That's a very different thing. So he is looking for somebody who will be a sympathetic ear, instead of necessarily somebody who will blow him away with the legal skills. Now, maybe they'll surprise us and they will come up with the equivalent of a Neil Gorsuch kind of, and if you think about what was done well in the past 100 days, that was a very solid choice, no matter what you think about, his politics. There's no question he was eminently qualified for the job, and it was rolled out well.
Yeah.
Right? And you keep asking yourself, if they can do that well, how come they did last night so badly? I mean, last night reminded me of, the days when the question about the first-year New York Mets, was, can't anybody here play this game? And, that was sort of the level of amateur hour yesterday. So I don't quite get what it is that allows them to do some things perfectly well and other things to seem to forget those skills.
Sure, Pat.
Yeah, two questions for David. How big was today's meeting at the White House for Putin, who has been trying to get a meeting with President Trump? And the second question is, how significant is the announcement by the new Korean president that he is willing to go to North Korea? What, do you see that doing to the whole process?
Well, on the first question, it's interesting that the Obama administration people I spoke to today said they never really wanted to let Lavrov in to go see President Obama because they felt it would be rewarding the Russians after Ukraine and so forth. But since Putin had just seen Tillerson, I think they probably felt that they had no choice in this case. On President Moon, or President-elect Moon until 12 hours from now, saying that he would go to North Korea, there's no surprise here. He was chief of staff to President No, who was the South Korean president a decade ago. You may remember he left office in a scandal and ultimately committed suicide a year later. But he took a trip to North Korea, which Mr. Moon actually arranged for. And prior to that, Kim Dae-jung, who was sort of the originator of the Sunshine Policy, another South Korean president, longtime dissident, nearly killed by the military governments that went before him. He went to North Korea as well. He got in a lot of trouble later on for it because it turned out he paid off the North Koreans to let him come visit. That didn't work out well for him once it became public. There's something in South Korean politics that pushes toward the let's just sit down and meet and talk as Koreans, as opposed to the way we look at it, which is we will have a summit meeting between leaders after we've set up the conditions correctly for it. And that's the collision between the United States and South Korea that's on the way.
Yes, here.
George Jazanowski. All White Houses have this problem of who are the children and who are the adults. And in this White House, it's gotten out of control. It's more or less mayhem from the way you describe it. Having said that, I'd like to pull each of you out on who you think could be the adults, either in the White House or in the cabinet, that begins to allow them to play ball successfully. I mean, if you go back and look at the Reagan administration or the Carter administration or any of these, you had situations where they floundered for quite some time until a Jim Baker appeared or someone like that. Who do you see as the adult in the White House or in the cabinet or in the Congress, as far as that goes, that can have enough of Trump's ear for him to listen, which means he's got to be a particular kind of person, he or she, and at the same time get him to grow up more?
Well, I mean, the phrase that you've no doubt heard that's circulating is the axis of adults, which would be now McMaster as National Security Advisor and Mattis over at the Pentagon, and then usually the third person people point to is Kelly over at Homeland Security, who,
All
whatever
military.
you think. Sorry?
All military.
All military. Whatever you think of, the policies they're coming up with, they're coming to this as they're all older, they're all white, they're all men, they're all military. Does that mean, is that a problem? Maybe, if they're all, looking at a problem and seeing a military solution. Maybe not. The other distinguishing feature of that trio would be none of them have political experience. Military experience, yes. National security experience, yes. Navigating Washington, getting stuff done on the Hill, and the interagency process, no. And I suspect that has led to some of these big bumps we've seen in the road. They're learning, and they're learning fast, and they've got staff, starting to come up. But that's what we're really seeing. Is it's seasoned, experienced advisors, but who are in a world that they have never had to navigate before. State Department, CIA, I mean, every institution in town is run by people who have not had this level of experience in the government. The only politician in the group would be Pompeo. Out at CIA.
What's happened to the chief of staff, Priebus? Is he no longer relevant? You don't hear anything about Bannon, so he's obviously pushed aside.
I don't know if he's quite out.
I don't think so.
What do you think?
There were stories a few weeks ago that Bannon was on the way out. Something has happened. He's been lower profile, but I think he's still, Trump is very reluctant to fire him, we're told. And Priebus was, I know what I know from Glenn Thrush on this one and Maggie Haberman, was hanging, his position was tenuous, but then they got the House health care bill through, and that was considered a victory for him. So, I mean, I think a lot of them are on edge over there. I don't think anybody feels jobs are secure, but I would certainly agree with Mary Louise that it's these three military guys. And who don't necessarily, as you know, believe in military action, because they've seen it and they're not, freewheeling with it.
I look a little bit at the nexus between Mattis and Tillerson. They reached an agreement a number of months ago that they would never put forth a big national security proposal without consulting with each other first and bringing it jointly. And that's something that Condoleezza Rice and Bob Gates did, and then Hillary Clinton and Bob Gates did. Usually pretty successfully. It broke down eventually toward the end of Gates's time, but for a while it was pretty formidable when the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense came together. For Tillerson, I think it's a particularly uphill battle here, and here's why. You have a president who said he's going to emphasize national security, and he increased the budget dramatically for the Defense Department and for intelligence, and proposed cutting it 30% for the State Department. So what message does that send? That while Secretary Tillerson thinks that the State Department is a critical part of American national security, the president may not share that view. And so we don't know if it's possible to have that kind of partnership that we've seen before.
Just a few more minutes, so back in the back there.
Which one?
You decide, I can't.
Okay, you had your hand up before.
Yeah.
Stanley Kober. I'm looking at an article from the New York Times in January on this subject, obviously, since it's January. It was called "What's the Big Deal?" It was about the Trump supporters. Even if the Russians did do it, which some were more willing to concede than others, what difference did it make? People did not need the Russians to make up their minds about Mrs. Clinton. Blaming her loss on the Russians was, as one Trump supporter said, quote, just being sore losers, unquote. This is an obsession with Washington and the media. Is it an obsession with other people? I mean, even in Washington, I have never walked into a bar, sat down, and enjoyed everybody else watching RT. Has not happened. Do people care about this so much? I remember when I was a college student, Vietnam was a big deal. Now the president is discussing putting more troops into Afghanistan. We've not even mentioned it. College campuses, no one cares. Has the country changed?
Well, I mean, one way to answer that question is take politics out of it completely. Take the whole, whatever, I can't remember which of your bins it was, but take the investigation into collusion between Trump aides and Russia, potential collusion. Take that out of our conversation, and just unless you, along with President Trump, doubt the consensus of the 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, who have concluded that Russia interfered with the US election and did so with a specific aim to tip it to one of the candidates. That's a big deal. I think people do care about that. They should care about that, and they should care about it going forward. It's important to understand what happened and why, and there's some urgency to figuring out, is there a way to prevent that from happening going forward in Europe and then in the next round of elections here?
Yeah, it is a big deal, and I mean, I think the article you read was expressing a viewpoint, a viewpoint that is held by some out there. At the same time, I will say that in the 22 years, I guess, I've been at the Washington Post, I have never seen the outpouring of emails and letters and postcards that I've seen in the last, say, 3 or 4 months from readers just saying, thank you for doing what you're doing, for reporting on what you're reporting. This is so important. It's so important to our democracy. I mean, David and I haven't yet had a chance to talk about this, but what happened last year was really unprecedented. I still remember I broke the story of the Russian hack of the DNC in June of last year, and at that time, the day the story ran, it was huge news, but we thought this was traditional political espionage, right? The Russians hacking into the campaign of a political candidate looking for intelligence information on what this potential next president could, her plans and intentions could be. And after all, Russians and Chinese have long done that. They did that in 2008, they did that in 2012. Okay, what's different? What changed was, very the next day, actually, we saw some signs that this may not be hacking business as usual when some person calling himself Guccifer 2.0, claiming to be Romanian, said, oh, I hacked the DNC, but I'm not Russian, and started putting out some hacked emails as proof. And I thought that was maybe, first sense that maybe this is Russia doing some disinformation. Then, about a month later, it was July 22nd, maybe, or just a few days before the Democratic National Convention, WikiLeaks dumps 40,000 emails out into the public, including some embarrassing, damaging emails that showed that the DNC was kind of discussing ways to undermine Bernie Sanders, and that had obvious, huge political effect, coming so close to the convention, and forced the resignation of the DNC chairwoman and her executive director. Suddenly, to me, it was evident, I'm sure to you, David, that we were in a new level, that Russia had taken this sort of hacking to a new level, hacking and dumping. This was now, political sabotage or weaponizing information. And it didn't end. Why? Because part of it was, as David and I have been reporting, the Obama administration was, in a sense, caught flat-footed, or was not prepared for what Russia was doing, and was debating with itself internally how to respond to this new provocation. And there were many intense internal debates, and I think when you cut right to the chase, at the senior-most levels, going all the way up to President Obama, despite, you could say, well, we want to deter Russia, but we also fear escalation. We don't want to undermine what Secretary Kerry is trying to do in Syria to broker a ceasefire with Russia. The central, I think, fear too was a fear of looking like they were going to be putting their thumb on the scales to help Hillary Clinton, and in that case, interfere in the election. As a result, I think one could argue this is what encouraged Russia to continue its releases, and on October 7th, they dumped the Podesta emails. On the very same day that actually the Obama administration had come out publicly and blamed Russia, pointed the finger at Russia for carrying out the hacks and interfering in the election. That same day, Russia nonetheless put out the Podesta emails. So it's pretty important.
Let's do the last, back here, and then I'll just have both you ask the same question, and you can answer it. So what's your question?
Can you comment on the power struggle between Trump and National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster? Do you think we'll have a third National Security Advisor in the near future?
Okay, and then down here.
David alluded to it being unlikely
what kind of could you elaborate on what kind of an investigation you see unfolding that would be believable to the American people?
Well, the special prosecutor law is expired, so that's what makes this difficult. There are ways to get at it, but very hard to imagine anybody within the Trump administration doing this themselves and thus recreating the kind of independent force that Comey was until this time yesterday. So I think the more likely structure for this is some kind of a separate congressional committee or 9/11 style commission. And I think the administration will fight both of those from happening.
But those are things Congress can do on their own, which is the
That's right.
critical thing.
That's right,
Yeah.
and so he may not be able to block it. To the question on McMaster, well, first of all, whenever you read about tensions like this, you always got to go back and say, why am I reading this? Who's getting sad? And there is a faction that does not like H.R. McMaster because they think he comes out of a very traditional military internationalist wing. In fact, I've known him for a number of years. I couldn't tell you if he was a Democrat or a Republican. He's very much a pragmatist. He's sort of a tell me what will work here. His experience was largely in the Middle East wars, as you would expect for somebody of his age who's come up as now a 3-star general. So he spent 15 years thinking about counterinsurgency, and suddenly he's got to deal with Russian hacking and the 50-year Thucydides trap of dealing with China and an Iran deal that he didn't have to pay very much attention to in his previous life. So I think he's kind of feeling his way, and he's managing a boss who I think it's fair to say at this point, mood is sort of hard to gauge on any given day. So he's got a big task ahead of him. I think that dismissing Comey last night makes it a lot harder for President Trump to then go through a second, this would be the second, if he got rid of him, the second national security advisor in 120 days. That's, pretty quick turnover. I see some tensions out there, but I don't see anything that would be a significant break. I think the worst tension came when President Trump said the other day that he was going to make the South Koreans pay for the THAAD radar that we're putting in. Why you would say that a week before an election where you were trying to avoid the outcome they got, I do not know. But McMaster had to go out and walk that back and say, well, actually, we have an agreement with the South Koreans. We're paying for X, they're paying for Y. And that agreement still holds. And I think that probably annoyed the president. But I don't have any indication that there's such a breach that his job is in any jeopardy.
On the other hand, all the palace intrigue is hard to read. Not one of us, if we'd been sitting here 2 nights ago, would have told you Jim Comey was less than 24 hours to go on the job. So who knows?
Including Jim Comey, if he had been sitting there.
Including Jim Comey.
And on that note, thank you, panelists. Thank you all, and thank you for coming.